friends, colleagues, and fellow citizens. Let me begin with a question that I believe cuts right to the heart of today's subject. Why is it that the world's richest agricultural nation, the United States, finds itself in a trade conflict with its northern neighbor, Canada, over something as basic as corn? Corn, a crop that is practically synonymous with American farming, is now a battleground in the global struggle of trade wars, subsidies, and corporate profit. This isn't just about agriculture, it's about power, politics, and who gets to decide the economic future of millions of working people in the United States and Canada alike. Corn is not just a crop, it is a pillar of American farming. It feeds livestock, fuels ethanol, and fills the pockets of agribusiness giants. Yet when we look at the corn trade war with Canada, what do we see? We see two governments, both heavily subsidizing their farmers, both maneuvering tariffs and quotas, both claiming to defend their national interests. But ask yourself, whose interests are really being defended? Is it the small and medium farmers across Iowa, Nebraska, and Illinois whose livelihoods hang in the balance? Or is it the multinational corporations that dominate agricultural trade, the Cargills and ADMs, who use governments as their personal bodyguards in the marketplace? Canada's agricultural policy, with its system of protections and subsidies, does not exist in a vacuum. It pushes back against U.S. dominance, trying to shield its farmers from being drowned by the tidal wave of cheap, mass-produced American corn. And Washington, in turn, responds with tariffs, threats, and lawsuits at the World Trade Organization. This is less a friendly dispute among neighbors and more a corporate chess match, where the pawns are family farmers and the stakes are rural communities hollowed out by economic insecurity. Now, here's the hook. While we are encouraged to think of this conflict as America versus Canada, in truth, it is not. The real divide is between those who own and control the agricultural system and those who work within it. Canadian farmers are not the enemies of American farmers. Both are trapped in a system where governments are pressured to serve the interests of the few over the needs of the many. That is the capitalist dynamic: competition, not cooperation; profit, not sustainability. And the consequences ripple outward. Trade wars mean uncertainty in prices. Uncertainty means small farmers cannot plan for the future. Many are forced into debt, foreclosure, or consolidation into the hands of larger agribusinesses. The trade war, then, is not merely about tariffs. It becomes a mechanism for accelerating inequality in both countries. Corn has long been seen as the backbone of American agriculture, a crop so deeply tied to the history and economy of the United States that it has become more than food or fuel. It has become a symbol of national abundance. Yet when we examine corn within the framework of the U.S.-Canada trade dispute, we begin to see that this crop functions not simply as a source of nourishment or even as a raw material for industries such as biofuels and livestock feed, but as an instrument of economic power. Corn in this context is a political tool, a bargaining chip wielded by governments and corporations alike to exert influence over markets, policies, and international relations. What appears on the surface as an agricultural disagreement quickly reveals itself as part of a much larger economic struggle over who controls the flows of capital and commodities across borders. The centrality of corn to U.S. agriculture makes it an especially potent lever in trade conflicts. American farms produce hundreds of millions of tons of corn annually, much of it heavily subsidized by Washington. Those subsidies reduce production costs, allowing U.S. corn to be sold at lower prices in both domestic and international markets. While this may be presented as a way to support American farmers, in reality, it functions as a competitive weapon, enabling U.S. agribusiness to flood foreign markets with cheap corn. For Canada, whose own farmers operate under a different system of agricultural protections, this influx is not a benign development. It threatens to destabilize local farming economies by undercutting their prices. Thus, corn ceases to be a neutral crop and instead becomes a vehicle for projecting U.S. economic dominance into Canadian markets. This dynamic illustrates a recurring theme in trade wars. Agricultural goods are rarely just agricultural goods. They carry with them the weight of state subsidies, international law, and corporate interests. Corn embodies this perfectly. The U.S. government does not defend corn production simply to keep family farms afloat. It defends corn because corn represents leverage. Control of corn exports means influence over food systems, over energy supplies through ethanol, and over the global marketplace where corn-derived products from sweeteners to plastics circulate widely. In effect, corn becomes a strategic resource, almost like oil or steel in earlier industrial eras. To wage a trade dispute with corn as the focal point is to engage in an economic contest that goes far beyond the surface question of farm prices. The Canadian response to this reality is both defensive and assertive. By instituting tariffs, quotas, and subsidies of its own, Canada seeks to prevent U.S. corn from overwhelming its domestic agriculture. From Washington's perspective, these measures look like protectionism, an unfair barrier to what American policymakers call free trade. Yet the irony is that U.S. corn itself is not produced in a free market. It is shaped and sustained by government intervention. What is presented as market efficiency is in fact state-supported advantage. This is where corn's role as an instrument of power becomes clearest. The United States leverages its vast subsidies not just to sustain production, but to exert political and economic pressure abroad. Canada's resistance, therefore, is not merely about protecting its farmers. It is about resisting incorporation into a global food system dominated by American agribusiness. The debate over corn in the U.S.-Canada trade war also exposes the way agricultural disputes are framed for public consumption. Leaders in both countries often talk about defending the national interest or protecting farmers, but the real beneficiaries are not small family farms, which continue to struggle with debt, uncertainty, and market volatility. Instead, the primary beneficiaries are the multinational corporations that dominate corn processing, distribution, and export. These corporations understand that corn is not just a commodity, but a power base. Whoever controls its flow can shape entire sectors of the economy, from energy to manufacturing to international trade negotiations. Thus, when tariffs are raised or retaliatory measures imposed, what we are really witnessing is a battle between competing capitalist interests dressed up in the language of patriotism and food security. This transformation of corn into a strategic instrument also highlights a broader contradiction within the global capitalist system. On one hand, markets are supposed to function through competition, with prices determined by supply and demand. On the other hand, states intervene aggressively to tilt the playing field in favor of their own producers, using subsidies, regulations, and international trade mechanisms as tools of influence. Corn reveals this contradiction starkly. It shows how economic nationalism and corporate globalization operate hand in hand, Nations proclaim their independence while their policies serve the interests of global agribusiness giants. What makes this situation particularly striking is the ripple effect it produces beyond the immediate participants in the trade war. Price fluctuations in corn do not stay confined to U.S. and Canadian borders. They ripple into global markets, affecting food prices in Mexico, livestock feed costs in Asia, and biofuel production across Europe. Corn, by virtue of its central role in global agriculture, acts almost like a domino. Once tipped, it sets off a cascade of economic consequences. This interconnectedness underscores just how powerful corn has become as an instrument of economic policy. Ultimately, when we analyze the U.S.-Canada corn dispute, we cannot afford to see it as a minor quarrel over agricultural goods. It is a case study in how seemingly ordinary commodities can be transformed into instruments of political and economic power. Corn is not just corn, it is leverage, it is strategy, and it is a reflection of the broader forces shaping our world economy. To understand corn in this light is to understand why agricultural disputes matter so deeply and why they reveal so much about the balance of power between nations, corporations, and the farmers caught in between. When trade disputes erupt between nations, the public is often told that these conflicts are about defending hardworking farmers, ensuring fair competition, or protecting national sovereignty. The rhetoric is filled with images of small farms, families laboring in the fields, and rural communities struggling to hold on. Yet if we scratch beneath the surface of these narratives, a very different picture comes into focus. The real winners in these disputes are almost always the largest corporations, while the real losers are small and medium farmers who lack the political influence, financial reserves, and bargaining power to survive prolonged instability. In the case of the corn trade war between the United States and Canada, this dynamic is glaringly obvious. Corporate agribusiness reaps the benefits, while family farmers find themselves increasingly squeezed, vulnerable, and in many cases pushed out of the very industry they helped build. To understand why this is the case, we need to examine the structural relationship between government policy and corporate power. Trade disputes are not spontaneous eruptions of economic disagreement. They are carefully managed confrontations that unfold within the framework of state intervention. When the U.S. government imposes tariffs on Canadian agricultural products, or when Canada sets quotas to limit U.S. corn imports, the justification is framed in terms of protecting national farmers. But those farmers do not all stand on equal ground. Large agribusiness corporations, massive firms with global operations, enormous lobbying budgets, and deep financial backing stand to benefit from the very policies that smaller farmers cannot endure. A prolonged trade war means market volatility, and volatility disproportionately harms those without the cushion of corporate reserves. For small farmers, fluctuating corn prices are not an abstract market issue, but a matter of survival. A sharp dip in prices can mean falling below the cost of production, driving them into debt, while a sudden spike can mean soaring costs for feed and other essentials. Corporations, however, thrive in these conditions. They have the capital to hedge against risks, diversify their holdings, and exploit market turbulence. In fact, volatility often creates opportunities for them to consolidate their power by buying up distressed farms and expanding their control over land and resources. Thus, every round of tariffs and counter-tariffs becomes less about leveling the playing field and more about clearing the field of smaller competitors. The corn trade war also shines a spotlight on the disparity in political representation between small farmers and corporate interests. While rural communities struggle to get their voices heard, corporations maintain armies of lobbyists in Washington, Ottawa, and beyond. They fund campaigns, draft legislation, and exert pressure on policymakers. When trade policies are being written, it is these corporate voices that dominate the conversation. The result is that protecting farmers often becomes a euphemism for protecting corporate profit margins. Small and medium farmers are invoked rhetorically, used as symbols of national heritage and tradition, but rarely are their material needs given the same priority. Meanwhile, the economic fallout lands squarely on those least able to absorb it. Rural communities dependent on corn farming see their local economies destabilized. Equipment dealers, feed suppliers, and local businesses that rely on farmer spending all feel the effects of market uncertainty. Corporate giants, by contrast, can shift production across borders, manipulate supply chains, and pass costs down the line. Their operations are global, flexible, and resilient, while small farmers remain tied to their land, their harvest, and the immediate market conditions. In this way, the very structure of modern capitalism ensures that trade wars serve as a filter. The strong and wealthy consolidate, while the small and independent are forced out. This concentration of power is not incidental, it is the underlying logic of the system. Capitalism thrives on competition, but in practice it drives toward monopoly. Each disruption in trade, each policy maneuver accelerates that consolidation. The corn trade war with Canada provides yet another opportunity for large agribusinesses to extend their dominance. As smaller farmers in both the U.S. and Canada struggle with uncertainty, corporations quietly absorb market share. They buy the grain elevators, control the export terminals, and dictate the contracts that govern production. In the end, the rhetoric of national competition masks a much more insidious process, the strengthening of corporate oligopolies at the expense of independent farmers and the communities they sustain. It is also worth considering how this dynamic erodes the very social fabric of rural America. Family farms have long been cultural and economic anchors in many regions, yet trade wars hasten their decline. Each lost farm means fewer children in rural schools, fewer customers for local businesses, and fewer participants in community life. The disappearance of these farms is not merely an economic issue, it is a social and cultural one. And while politicians lament the decline of rural communities, their policies consistently reinforce the dominance of corporate actors who profit from that very decline. In the end, when we examine who truly benefits from the U.S. Canada corn trade war, it becomes clear that this is not a conflict fought for the survival of small farmers. It is a conflict shaped by corporate lobbying designed to maximize profits and sustained by a political system that privileges wealth over need. The winners are the multinational agribusiness giants who can absorb shocks, manipulate policies, and emerge stronger. The losers are the small and medium farmers whose livelihoods are undermined by forces far beyond their control. They are left to navigate a system that promises protection but delivers betrayal, while corporations continue to present themselves as the indispensable engines of agricultural progress. In reality, those engines run on the fuel of small farmers' losses, a reality that is obscured by the patriotic language of defending agriculture in the trade wars. Canada's position in the corn trade war with the United States is often misunderstood, especially in mainstream political and media discourse. It is too easy to frame Canada simply as a passive recipient of U.S. economic aggression or conversely, as a willing partner in a fair trade negotiation. The truth is much more complex. Canada's policies toward corn and agriculture more broadly are shaped by a conscious attempt to protect its domestic farming sector from being overrun by U.S. agribusiness, which produces corn at a scale and price point that Canadian farmers simply cannot match without government support. These protective measures are not just economic tools, but political strategies rooted in the recognition that agriculture is not an ordinary sector of the economy. It is a matter of national identity, food security, and social stability. In resisting U.S. corn imports through subsidies, quotas, and tariffs, Canada is asserting its right to defend those values, even at the risk of provoking trade conflict with its most powerful neighbor. The Canadian system of agricultural protections differs significantly from the American model, whereas the United States leans heavily on direct subsidies that allow farmers to produce corn at volumes far above what the market alone would dictate. Canada employs a mixture of quotas, tariffs, and supply management policies designed to stabilize domestic markets. These measures are meant to ensure that Canadian farmers can earn a viable living and that consumers enjoy consistent prices without being subject to the volatility of global commodity markets. In practice, this means that Canadian farmers cannot easily be driven out of business by sudden gluts of cheap foreign imports, particularly from the United States. When American corn floods the international market at artificially low prices, Canadian protections act as a buffer, preventing those distortions from hollowing out domestic production. This strategy has not gone unnoticed in Washington. To U.S. officials and corporate agribusiness lobbies, Canada's protective measures are framed as unfair barriers to free trade. They argue that such protections deny American corn producers access to a neighboring market that should, in their view, remain open and receptive to U.S. exports. The irony here is profound. The same U.S. system that decries Canadian protectionism is itself built on vast subsidies and government intervention. American corn is not the product of pure market forces. It is subsidized, incentivized, and defended at every level by the state. Yet when Canada engages in its own version of agricultural intervention, it is condemned as unfair competition. What emerges is less a disagreement about trade principles than a struggle over which country's interventions will dominate the terms of exchange. This dynamic is central to understanding the deeper political logic behind Canada's pushback. By refusing to capitulate to U.S. demands for greater market access, Canada is not merely defending farmers in a narrow economic sense. It is asserting a broader right to economic sovereignty in the face of an overbearing neighbor. Canada's agricultural protections reflect a deliberate choice to prioritize domestic stability and national control over the dictates of global markets dominated by U.S. corporations. To dismantle those protections under pressure from Washington would be to surrender a significant measure of autonomy, leaving Canadian farmers vulnerable to the fluctuations and predations of the global corn trade. At the same time, Canada's pushback underscores the unequal relationship between the two countries. The United States, with its vastly larger economy and political clout, wields trade disputes as instruments of leverage, pressing Canada to conform to its terms. Canada, in resisting, must constantly balance the immediate risks of U.S. retaliation against the long-term costs of opening its markets. This is why disputes over corn become so politically charged. They are not only about tariffs and quotas, but about the fundamental question of how a smaller economy can maintain independence while living in the shadow of a dominant partner. Every Canadian policy to restrict corn is a statement that national sovereignty is worth defending, even when it invites conflict. This resistance also carries social and cultural dimensions. Farming communities in Canada, much like those in the United States, are more than economic units. They are the backbone of rural life, sustaining local cultures, traditions, and economies. The destruction of Canadian corn farming at the hands of U.S. agribusiness would not simply be a matter of market efficiency. It would represent the hollowing out of entire communities, with ripple effects on employment, regional development, and social cohesion. By protecting these farmers, the Canadian government is implicitly defending rural Canada against the homogenizing pressures of global capitalism. From the perspective of U.S. corporations, however, Canada's pushback is an obstacle to expansion. For them, the Canadian market represents both a potential profit center and a stepping stone to broader global dominance. Removing Canadian protections would allow U.S. agribusiness to further entrench its position, consolidating its grip on North American agriculture. This is why Washington treats Canadian policies as a target of trade disputes. It is not simply about fairness, but about eliminating barriers to corporate growth. In this sense, Canada's agricultural protections are acts of resistance, not only against a foreign government, but against the broader logic of corporate consolidation that defines modern agriculture. The corn trade war between the two countries is therefore a struggle that extends far beyond the fields of corn themselves. It is a microcosm of the larger contest between economic sovereignty and corporate globalization, between smaller nations seeking to protect their farmers and communities and larger powers seeking to impose the rules of the global marketplace. Canada's pushback, though often criticized as protectionist, must be understood as a rational and necessary response to the overwhelming economic force of U.S. agribusiness. It is a defense of national priorities in a system that too often reduces agriculture to nothing more than a commodity to be traded, regardless of its social and cultural importance. When examining the corn trade war between the United States and Canada, one of the most misleading narratives presented to the public is that the conflict represents a straightforward national competition. The framing is simple: American farmers versus Canadian farmers, U.S. national interest against Canada's national interest. Politicians in both countries are eager to cast the dispute in these terms because it appeals to patriotism and creates the impression that governments are defending their people against foreign adversaries. But this framing masks the deeper reality. The real divide is not between the farmers of Iowa and the farmers of Ontario, nor between American citizens and Canadian citizens. True conflict lies between two classes: the corporations and elites who own and control the agricultural system on one side, and the workers and farmers who labor within it on the other. This reality is obscured by nationalist rhetoric, but once brought into focus, it changes how we understand not just this trade dispute, but the nature of trade wars in general. Agriculture in both the United States and Canada is structured in ways that favor large-scale operations and corporate dominance. In the United States, the corn industry is heavily shaped by agribusiness giants who control everything from seed patents to grain elevators, processing facilities, and export channels. These corporations use their resources to lobby Congress, influence trade agreements, and secure subsidies that keep their operations profitable even when prices collapse. Canada's system is somewhat different, with stronger protections for farmers and a supply management structure, but even there, corporate actors hold significant sway. What unites both systems is that the largest and most powerful players always find ways to shape policy in their favor, while small and medium farmers are left to struggle. In this light, the corn trade war is less about protecting farmers than about managing corporate competition across borders. When Washington protests Canada's tariffs or quotas, it is not because American family farms are being denied a fair chance to compete. It is because multinational agribusiness corporations want greater access to the Canadian market. Similarly, when Ottawa resists U.S. demands, it is not merely defending its farmers, but also protecting the space in which its own agricultural interests can operate without being consumed by American giants. Both governments act primarily as agents for corporate capital, dressing their maneuvers in the language of national defense to conceal the true beneficiaries of their actions. This point becomes even clearer when we look at how farmers themselves are affected. Farmers in the United States do not benefit when their government pushes Canada to open its markets. Even if exports increase, the gains are captured disproportionately by the corporations that own the supply chains. Prices may briefly stabilize or rise, but those benefits are unevenly distributed. The small farmer who operates at the margins of profitability remains vulnerable to debt and market fluctuations. Meanwhile, the corporations that control export contract shipping and processing see consistent profits regardless of whether the trade war intensifies or subsides. Canadian farmers, too, are caught in the middle. They depend on protections that allow them to survive against U.S. competition, but their ability to influence policy is far weaker than that of the corporate stakeholders who dominate the Canadian agricultural sector. In both countries, the farmers are pawns in a larger game whose rules are written elsewhere. The rhetoric of national competition is particularly effective because it turns workers and farmers against one another. By framing the trade war as a battle between American and Canadian interests, elites deflect attention from the structural inequality within each country. The U.S. farmer struggling under debt begins to see the Canadian farmer as the enemy rather than recognizing that both share a common predicament under corporate dominance. Canadian farmers, in turn, are told that their livelihoods are threatened not by global corporations, but by the aggression of U.S. producers. This divide and conquer strategy has long been a hallmark of capitalist politics. Keep workers and farmers focused on external rivals so that the internal hierarchies of wealth and power remain unchallenged. What makes this dynamic so damaging is the way it perpetuates the myth that governments are neutral arbiters balancing the needs of all citizens. In truth, both Ottawa and Washington are deeply enmeshed with corporate power. Trade policies, subsidies, and retaliatory measures are shaped not in town halls with farmers, but in corporate boardrooms and policy circles dominated by business interests. The agricultural system, therefore, is not simply a space of economic competition. It is a political battlefield where corporations enlist governments to enforce their priorities. Trade wars like the corn dispute become instruments of this enforcement, further entrenching corporate dominance under the guise of protecting national interests. There is also an ideological dimension to this divide. By presenting trade wars as struggles between nations, Governments reinforce the idea that prosperity and security are best achieved through competition rather than cooperation. Yet the reality of modern agriculture demonstrates the opposite. Farmers on both sides of the US-Canada border face similar challenges: volatile prices, mounting debt, environmental pressures, and the relentless consolidation of agribusiness. Their interests align far more with each other than with the corporations that dominate their respective economies. But the ideology of nationalism prevents this recognition, keeping them divided and vulnerable. This deeper reality transforms our understanding of the corn trade war. It is not a patriotic struggle, but a class conflict. The divide is not horizontal between nations, but vertical between those who own and those who labor. Recognizing this changes the narrative. Canadian farmers are not enemies of American farmers, and workers in either country have no interest in perpetuating a conflict that strengthens only the corporations. Instead, the real struggle is against the system that pits neighbor against neighbor while consolidating wealth and power at the top. By pulling back the veil of nationalist rhetoric, the corn trade war becomes a case study in how capitalism sustains itself through manufactured divisions, state intervention on behalf of elites, and the silencing of those most affected by the policies being enacted in their name. One of the most far-reaching consequences of the corn trade war between the United States and Canada is its role in deepening inequality within agriculture and beyond. Trade disputes of this kind are often portrayed as technical matters of tariffs, quotas, and subsidies, but behind those technical details lie real human costs. The instability that accompanies a trade war, rapid price fluctuations, unpredictable demand, and shifting market access hits small and medium farmers the hardest, while the largest agribusiness corporations not only weather the storm, but often emerge stronger. The result is an acceleration of consolidation in the agricultural sector, with power and wealth concentrated in fewer hands, and communities across North America left increasingly vulnerable. At the heart of this inequality is the volatility introduced into corn markets. When trade wars disrupt established patterns of exchange, corn prices swing wildly, creating uncertainty for farmers whose livelihoods depend on stable conditions. A farmer planning next year's crop cannot easily commit to planting, investing in equipment, or hiring labor if there is no clear sense of what prices will be in 6 months. For many small and medium operations, even minor fluctuations can mean the difference between survival and bankruptcy. A sudden drop in prices can leave farmers unable to cover their costs, while a sudden rise may increase feed expenses for those raising livestock, creating pressure in another part of the system. In both cases, smaller farmers lack the reserves to absorb these shocks. Corporations, however, thrive in environments of instability. Large agribusiness firms have diversified portfolios, access to sophisticated financial instruments, and the ability to hedge against risk in futures markets. They can shift production, storage, and distribution strategies in response to changes in policy or market conditions, while smaller farmers remain tied to their land and dependent on immediate returns. This imbalance means that the very turbulence that undermines independent producers becomes an opportunity for corporations to expand their control. When smaller farms fail, corporations and large investors often step in to purchase land at discounted prices, further consolidating ownership. The inequality deepened by trade wars is not limited to ownership of land or control of production. it extends to political influence as well. As farms consolidate into larger entities, the political clout of independent farmers diminishes while the influence of corporate agribusiness grows. Trade disputes provide an avenue for these corporations to expand that influence as governments turn to them for guidance, expertise, and lobbying pressure in shaping responses. Policies are crafted in ways that secure corporate interests first, ensuring that they emerge from trade wars with minimal disruption. Meanwhile, the specific needs of small farmers are sidelined, addressed only superficially in political rhetoric, but rarely reflected in actual policy outcomes. This deepening inequality reverberates through rural communities. The decline of small and medium farms is not simply a matter of individual hardship. Each farm represents a node in a larger network of economic and social relationships. When farms close or consolidate, local equipment suppliers lose customers, rural schools see declining enrollment, and small towns lose vital tax bases. Communities that once thrived on the strength of independent farming find themselves hollowed out with fewer businesses, fewer jobs, and fewer opportunities for young people. The corn trade war exacerbates this process by accelerating the pace of closures and consolidations, leaving behind a landscape increasingly dominated by large-scale operations that are less connected to local communities and more oriented toward global markets. The ripple effects extend beyond the countryside. As inequality grows in the agricultural sector, it mirrors and reinforces inequality in society at large. Consumers may not always see the immediate impact of a trade war on their grocery bills, but they are affected in subtler ways. The concentration of power among a few agribusiness corporations gives them greater ability to dictate prices, control supply chains, and shape food systems. What was once a diverse, locally rooted agricultural landscape becomes a homogenized system where decisions about food production are made far from the communities that depend on it. This centralization not only undermines economic democracy, but also places enormous power in the hands of corporations that operate with little accountability to the public. Trade wars like the one between the US and Canada also highlight the broader contradictions of modern capitalism. They show how policies enacted in the name of fairness or national interest often serve to entrench the very inequalities they claim to address. The rhetoric of defending farmers masks a process in which smaller farmers are pushed out and corporate dominance is reinforced. The instability created by tariffs and retaliations does not harm all actors equally. It creates a sorting mechanism, pushing the vulnerable to the margins and rewarding those with the resources to exploit volatility. Inequality, in this sense, is not an accidental byproduct of trade wars, but an integral feature of how they operate. The human cost of this deepening inequality cannot be overlooked. For many farming families, the corn trade war translates into heightened stress, mounting debt, and an uncertain future. Generational farms, passed down for decades, are sold off under pressure, severing ties to the land and traditions that form part of the cultural fabric of rural North America. Young people are discouraged from pursuing farming careers, seeing little stability or opportunity in an industry dominated by giant corporations. The result is a cycle in which inequality is reproduced not only economically, but socially, as the pathways to independence and stability through farming are closed off to new generations. Corn trade war, then, is not just an isolated conflict over tariffs between two neighboring countries. It is a vivid example of how global economic disputes can sharpen divides within societies, rewarding the few while punishing the many. By creating volatility that small farmers cannot survive, it accelerates the transfer of land, wealth, and power to corporate hands. In doing so, it contributes to a broader trend of inequality that extends beyond agriculture, shaping the future of rural communities and deepening the divides that already define the modern economy. So let us be clear. The U.S.-Canada corn trade war is not about patriotic defense of farmers. It is about which country's corporations get the upper hand in shaping the rules of global agriculture. Until we recognize that, we will continue to see our farmers, our rural communities, squeezed, sacrificed, and sidelined in service to corporate profit. The solution is not more tariffs, nor more subsidies for the already powerful. The solution lies in cooperation across borders, in solidarity among farmers and working people, and in rethinking a system that pits neighbor against neighbor while enriching the few. If we want a future where agriculture serves human need rather than corporate greed, then we must start asking new questions and demanding new answers. Thank you.